My name is Jake Thompson, and at my younger sister's wedding, she stood in front of 300 guests, raised a champagne glass, and called me the biggest underachiever in our family. Everyone laughed. Her friends laughed. My parents laughed. Even a few of the groom's relatives laughed, despite having no idea who I was. Emma smiled and waited for the reaction to settle. Then she added another joke, one she'd apparently been saving for a special occasion. "If ambition were genetic," she said, "Jake must have missed that part of the family." The room erupted again. I smiled politely. What else was I supposed to do? Argue with the bride at her own wedding? Walk out? Make a scene? So I stood there and let the moment pass, just like I had done my entire life. Because in my family, Emma was the success story. The lawyer, the achiever, the daughter everyone proudly talked about. And I was simply Jake, the older brother who worked with his hands. The brother nobody introduced first. The brother people politely changed the subject after mentioning. For years, that had been enough for everyone, including me. At least, that's what I thought. Then something happened that nobody expected, not my parents, not the guests, and certainly not Emma. The groom slowly stood up from his chair. At first, I assumed he was about to continue the toast. Maybe tell a story about how they met. Maybe say something sentimental. Instead, he reached for the microphone and looked directly at Emma. The smile disappeared from her face almost immediately. Not completely, just enough for me to notice. Then he turned toward the audience. "Before we continue," he said, "there's something everyone here deserves to know." The ballroom became quiet. People exchanged confused looks. Emma looked nervous, for the first time all evening. I remember thinking that was strange, because Emma never got nervous. Not in court, not in meetings, not in front of crowds. Then the groom said something that made my stomach tighten. 8 years ago, Emma came very close to losing everything. The room went silent. My parents frowned. Emma's smile vanished completely. And suddenly, every guest in the ballroom was paying attention, because this wasn't part of the wedding speech. This wasn't part of the celebration. This was something else, something nobody saw coming. What happened next exposed a secret my sister had hidden for nearly a decade, forced my parents to confront a truth they had ignored for years, and turned the most important day of Emma's life into a night she would never forget. But to understand why the groom stood up that evening, you first need to understand how my family spent years celebrating one child while completely overlooking the other. 3 weeks before Emma's wedding, I was replacing a damaged support beam at a construction site outside Columbus when my phone started buzzing. I ignored it at first. When you're balancing on a scaffold 30 feet above the ground, family group chats aren't exactly a priority, but the notifications kept coming. By lunchtime, there were 17 unread messages. Most of them came from my mother. Wedding updates, guest lists, seating arrangements, flower photos. The entire family seemed to be operating as if the wedding were a national event, which, in a way, it was, at least for them. Emma wasn't just getting married. She was marrying a successful investment consultant named Daniel. To my parents, it felt like the final chapter in a perfect success story. Their daughter had graduated near the top of her law school class, built a respected legal career, bought a beautiful house, and now she was marrying the kind of man my mother loved introducing to people, the kind with impressive credentials. Meanwhile, I spent most of my days on construction sites, managing crews, solving problems, working long hours. My parents respected what I did. At least I think they did, but they never celebrated it. Not the way they celebrated Emma. Growing up, the difference wasn't subtle. When Emma brought home an A, the report card ended up on the refrigerator. When I rebuilt an engine with my grandfather at 16, my father nodded and said, "That's useful." Useful. That was the word people always used for me. Reliable, practical, dependable. Never exceptional, never impressive, just useful. The strange thing is that I didn't resent Emma for most of it. None of it was her fault in the beginning. She was smart, driven, ambitious. She earned a lot of her success. The problem wasn't Emma. The problem was what happened after years of being told that one person's achievements mattered more than everyone else's. Eventually, people start believing it, including the person receiving all the praise. The Sunday before the wedding, my parents hosted a family dinner. Naturally, the conversation revolved around Emma, the wedding, the honeymoon, the guest list, the future. At one point, my uncle asked how work was going. Before I could answer, my mother smiled. "Jake's busy as always." Then she immediately turned back to Emma. "So, have you two decided where you're spending Christmas?" That was it. My entire contribution to the conversation. Jake's busy as always. Nobody meant any harm. That's what made it worse. Being ignored wasn't an event. It was a habit, one everyone had stopped noticing years ago. After dinner, I helped my father move tables into the garage. While we worked, he said something that stayed with me. "Your mother hasn't been this excited in years," I laughed. "I noticed." He smiled. "Emma's worked hard for this life." I nodded, because she had. But as I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the way everyone talked about her success, as if she'd built it entirely alone, as if there hadn't been difficult moments, mistakes, setbacks, or people who helped her when things went wrong. What nobody at that dinner knew was that 8 years earlier, Emma had come dangerously close to losing everything she'd worked for. A mistake during a legal internship had triggered a chain reaction that could have ended her career before it even began. At the time, only a handful of people knew how serious the situation really was. Even fewer knew what it took to fix it. The story eventually disappeared. The crisis faded. Emma's career recovered, and life moved on. But some secrets don't stay buried forever, especially when one of the few people who knows the truth is standing beside you on your wedding day. And 3 weeks before Emma walked down the aisle, that secret was already moving quietly toward the surface. 2 weeks before the wedding, Emma called me at 6:30 on a Saturday morning. I was still asleep, which was unusual. Most weekends I was already at a job site before sunrise. I answered anyway. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Emma said. "I just need a favor." Of course she did. Over the next 10 minutes, she explained that several vendors had canceled at the last minute. The reception venue needed additional staging. Decorations had to be transported across town, and someone needed to coordinate setup crews the day before the wedding. By the time she finished talking, I realized she wasn't asking for one favor. She was asking for an entire weekend. "I already hired people," she said, "but you're better at organizing this stuff." This stuff. That was how Emma described the work I'd spent most of my adult life doing. Managing projects, coordinating teams, solving logistical problems. I agreed anyway, because despite everything, she was still my sister. The following weekend, I spent nearly 12 hours helping prepare the venue. I unloaded equipment, directed contractors, helped assemble staging, solved problems every time something went wrong. At one point, a delivery arrived, missing several decorative panels. The event coordinator started panicking. Within an hour, I had located replacements and arranged transportation. Crisis solved. Nobody even noticed, which was exactly how my job usually worked. Later that afternoon, I overheard Emma speaking with a group of bridesmaids. One of them pointed toward me. "Who's handling all of this?" Emma glanced in my direction. "Oh, that's Jake." Then she laughed lightly. "He's basically the family's emergency contact." The group laughed, not cruelly, just casually, like it was a harmless joke. Then the conversation immediately shifted back to Emma, the wedding, the honeymoon, the future. I stood there listening for a moment before returning to work. Because the truth was, I wasn't surprised. For years, that had been my role. Whenever something needed fixing, people called me. Whenever the problem was solved, people forgot who fixed it. And the closer we got to the wedding, the more I started realizing that, in my family's eyes, I wasn't really a guest. I was part of the support staff. The week before the wedding, my parents hosted a small family gathering for relatives arriving from out of town. Nothing formal, just dinner, drinks, and the usual conversations. By the time I arrived, nearly everyone was already there. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends I hadn't seen in years. The moment I walked inside, I knew exactly what the evening would be about. Emma. Every conversation somehow led back to her career, her wedding, her future. At one point, my aunt raised a glass and smiled. I still remember when Emma was a little girl. Several people laughed. Then she added, "Who would have guessed she'd become the most successful person in the family?" The room immediately agreed. My mother looked proud. My father smiled. Emma thanked everyone modestly. And just like that, the story started. People took turns talking about her achievements. Law school, her legal career, the house she bought, the wedding, one accomplishment after another. I sat quietly and listened. Not because I was upset, because there wasn't much else to do. Then my cousin unexpectedly looked at me. "What about you, Jake?" For a second, I thought someone was finally asking about my life. Instead, he laughed. "When are you going to stop working so hard and let Emma hire you?" Several people chuckled. Someone else joked that I could become the family's full-time handyman. The comments weren't meant to be insulting. That was the problem. Nobody thought twice before saying them. Because somewhere along the way, everyone had accepted the same idea. Emma was the success story. I was the guy who helped. The guy who fixed things. The guy people called when something broke. A few minutes later, my mother stood to make a toast. She smiled at Emma, then said something that stayed with me. "Everything this family dreamed about for the future is sitting right here." The room applauded. Emma looked emotional. And as everyone celebrated her accomplishments, I realized something. Nobody in that room knew the full story. Nobody knew there was a chapter missing. A chapter that connected directly to the career everyone was praising. And in less than 2 weeks, that chapter was going to become impossible to ignore. 3 nights before the wedding, Emma hosted a rehearsal dinner for close family, the wedding party, and a few friends. The atmosphere was relaxed. People were laughing, sharing stories, drinking far more wine than they probably should have. For most of the evening, everything went exactly as expected. The conversation revolved around Emma and Daniel, how they met, their future plans, the life they were building together. Then, near the end of the night, someone suggested a toast. A few people shared short stories. Daniel talked about the first time he met Emma. Her maid of honor shared an embarrassing college memory. Everyone laughed. Then Emma stood, champagne glass in hand, a confident smile on her face. The room immediately quieted. Emma had always been good at commanding attention. She thanked everyone for coming, thanked her friends, thanked our parents, thanked Daniel. Then she started telling stories about family. Most were harmless. Funny childhood memories, old vacation disasters, the usual material. Then she got to me. There was always a big difference between Jake and me, she said. Several people smiled. I already knew where this was going. While I was planning my future, she paused dramatically. Jake was usually fixing something. The room laughed. I smiled politely. Then she continued. Honestly, if the legal career hadn't worked out, I probably could have hired him as my maintenance department. More laughter, louder this time. Even my mother laughed. Emma raised her glass. To Jake. The room joined in. Thanks for always being the person we call when something goes wrong. Everyone applauded. The comment sounded complimentary. That was what made it so effective. Because hidden inside the joke was the same message I'd heard for years. Emma was the person people admired. I was the person people used. As the applause faded, I noticed Daniel wasn't laughing. In fact, he looked uncomfortable. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the room. Then he glanced toward Emma, and the expression on his face made me wonder if he knew something the rest of us didn't. 3 days later, I got my answer. The day before the wedding, I arrived at the venue shortly after sunrise. Several vendors were already setting up. Tables were being arranged. Decorations were going up. And, as usual, Emma had a new list of problems that needed solving. For most of the morning, I moved from one task to another. A missing delivery, a scheduling conflict, a sound system issue. Nothing unusual, just the kind of problems people called me to handle. Around noon, I stepped inside the reception hall to grab a bottle of water. That's when I heard Emma talking with a group of guests near the stage. I wasn't trying to listen, but my name caught my attention. One of the guests asked how Emma had managed to build such a successful career so quickly. Emma smiled. The same confident smile she always used when telling a story she'd told 100 times before. A lot of hard work, she said. A few people nodded. Then she added, and a little luck. Everyone laughed. The conversation continued. Law school, her internship, the early years of her career, the version of the story everyone knew, the version everyone believed. I stood there listening quietly, because I noticed something. Not once did she mention the crisis, the mistake that nearly ended everything. The months she spent terrified her future was over. The people who helped her survive it. That entire chapter had simply disappeared, erased from the story, as if it had never happened. Maybe that shouldn't have bothered me. After all, it was her life, her career, her choice. But standing there, listening to people praise a version of events that wasn't entirely true, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, disappointment. Because for the first time, I started wondering whether Emma had forgotten what happened 8 years ago, or whether she was hoping everyone else would. And judging by the way Daniel watched her from across the room, I wasn't the only person thinking about it. The wedding reception started just after 6. By then, the ballroom was full. Friends, family, co-workers, clients. Nearly 300 people had gathered to celebrate Emma and Daniel. Everything looked perfect. The flowers, the lighting, the music, the kind of wedding people spend years planning. And for most of the evening, Emma was exactly where she wanted to be, the center of attention. Every table seemed to have a story about her, a success, an achievement, a milestone. People congratulated her constantly. My parents looked happier than I had seen them in years. My mother spent most of the reception introducing herself to guests, talking about Emma's career, talking about law school, talking about the wedding, talking about the future. Meanwhile, I stayed busy helping wherever I was needed. A vendor had a question. A coordinator needed assistance. Someone couldn't find a seating assignment. The usual. At one point, Daniel walked over while I was helping move a few extra chairs. "You've been working all day," I shrugged. "Someone has to." He smiled, then looked around the ballroom. "You know, most people would have gone home by now," I laughed. "Most people aren't related to Emma." To my surprise, Daniel laughed too. But a few seconds later, his smile faded, like there was something on his mind. Before I could ask, someone called his name from across the room. He nodded and walked away. An hour later, dinner ended and the speeches began. The maid of honor spoke first, then Daniel's best man. Both speeches were exactly what everyone expected. Funny stories, embarrassing memories, a few emotional moments, lots of applause. Then it was Emma's turn. The room immediately quieted. Emma stood slowly and accepted the microphone, confident, comfortable, completely in control. She thanked everyone for coming, thanked our parents, thanked Daniel, thanked her friends. Then she began telling stories. Most of them were harmless, until she got to me. A smile crossed her face. "Oh, and of course there's Jake." A few guests turned toward me. I felt my stomach tighten. Not because I was worried, because I already knew what was coming. The room laughed before she even continued. "Every family needs someone practical." More laughter. Emma raised her glass. "Some people build careers," she paused. "Some people build shelves." The ballroom erupted. Even my mother laughed. My father smiled. Emma waited for the reaction to settle, then delivered the line that would later be repeated by half the people in attendance. "If ambition were genetic," she smiled, "Jake must have missed that part of the family." The room exploded. Applause, laughter, cheers. I forced a smile. Emma raised her glass toward me. "To my brother." More laughter followed. Then she sat down, certain the moment had gone exactly as planned. Then Daniel slowly stood from his chair. Most people assumed he was about to continue the toast. Instead, he reached for the microphone. The room gradually became quiet again. Daniel looked at Emma, then at my parents, then across the ballroom, and finally at me. The expression on his face wasn't angry, it was determined, like someone who had spent a long time deciding whether to say something. Then he took a breath. "Before we continue," the room fell completely silent. "There's something everyone here deserves to know." Emma's smile disappeared instantly, and for the first time all evening, the bride looked scared. The ballroom became completely silent. Nearly 300 people were staring at Daniel, waiting, confused. Emma forced a small smile, the kind people use when they're trying to hide their discomfort. Daniel looked at her for a moment, then turned back to the audience. "Most of you know Emma as an attorney." Several guests nodded. "You know her as someone who worked hard, built a successful career, and earned everything she has." More nods. My parents smiled proudly. Daniel paused. That's true. The tension in the room eased slightly. Then he continued. But it's not the whole story. The smiles disappeared, including Emma's. Daniel adjusted the microphone. 8 years ago, before Emma became an attorney, she made a mistake during her internship. A murmur spread through the crowd. Emma immediately looked down at her table. The room was paying attention now. Real attention. Daniel continued carefully. The mistake was serious enough that her legal career nearly ended before it began. My mother frowned. My father looked confused. Several guests exchanged glances. Because this wasn't a wedding speech anymore. This was a confession. Daniel looked across the ballroom. Most people don't know that because very few people were aware of what happened. He paused. Even fewer know who helped her through it. The room became silent again. I felt my stomach tighten. Because suddenly, I knew exactly where this was going. So did Emma. Daniel looked toward me, then back at the audience. For years, people have praised Emma for overcoming that crisis. He nodded slowly. And she deserves credit for that. Another pause. But the reason she had the opportunity to recover at all, his voice became quieter, is because someone else stepped in when everyone else was walking away. Every eye in the ballroom followed his gaze, straight toward me. And for the first time that evening, people weren't looking at me because of Emma's joke. They were looking at me because they wanted answers. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The ballroom had become so quiet that I could hear glasses being set down on nearby tables. Daniel kept his eyes on the audience. Not on Emma, not on me, the audience. As some of you know, Emma and I started dating shortly after she recovered from that situation. A few guests nodded. Daniel smiled faintly. For years, I only knew the version of the story everyone else knew. He paused. The version where Emma overcame a difficult setback through determination and hard work. My parents nodded immediately, because that was the version they knew too. Then Daniel continued. A few months ago, while we were organizing old documents for the wedding, I came across something unexpected. The room grew even quieter. A letter. Emma closed her eyes briefly, almost as if she already knew what was coming. Daniel looked down for a moment, then back at the crowd. It was a letter Emma wrote 8 years ago. Several guests exchanged curious looks. Daniel carefully reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a piece of paper. The movement alone made the room tense. Because suddenly, everyone understood this wasn't speculation. There was proof. Daniel held up the paper. In that letter, Emma thanked the person who helped save her future. My mother frowned. My father sat completely still. Then Daniel read a single line. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you've done for me. The room remained silent. He looked up. Without you, I would have lost everything I worked for. A murmur spread across the ballroom. People were beginning to connect the dots. Daniel folded the letter slowly, then said the words nobody expected to hear at a wedding. The letter wasn't addressed to a professor. He paused. It wasn't addressed to a lawyer. Another pause. It wasn't addressed to a mentor. Then he turned toward me. It was addressed to Jake. And suddenly, every person in the ballroom understood that the story they had believed for years was missing a very important chapter. The ballroom froze. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Nobody even looked at their phones anymore. Every ounce of attention was locked on Daniel. Then it shifted to me. My parents looked completely stunned. My mother blinked several times, as if she was waiting for someone to explain what she had just heard. Daniel continued. At first, I thought the letter was symbolic. He glanced down at the folded paper in his hand. Then I started asking questions. Emma stared at the table, silent. Daniel took a slow breath. The more I learned, the more I realized Jake wasn't just someone offering emotional support. A few guests leaned forward, trying not to miss a word. He was the reason Emma had a second chance. The room remained perfectly still. Daniel continued. When the internship crisis happened, most people distanced themselves. He paused. Some people advised Emma to start over. Another pause. Others thought her career was finished before it even began. My father frowned, clearly hearing this story for the first time. Then Daniel looked toward me. Jake didn't walk away. A murmur moved through the audience. He spent months helping her deal with the fallout. The room grew quieter, if that was even possible. Daniel shook his head slightly, and he never told anyone. Not our parents, not relatives, not family friends, nobody. My mother slowly turned toward me. The confusion on her face was beginning to change into something else, something closer to disbelief. Then Daniel reached into his jacket again. This time, he removed a small folder. The moment Emma saw it, her expression changed, because she recognized it immediately. Daniel held it up. For the last few months, I've been collecting documents connected to that period. He looked around the room. Emails, financial records, correspondence, evidence, proof of what actually happened. Then he opened the folder. And for the first time all evening, Emma looked genuinely terrified about what Daniel might say next. Daniel opened the folder and removed several documents. The room was completely silent. Nobody was looking at the bride anymore. Everyone was looking at the evidence in Daniel's hands. For years, Daniel said, I wondered why Jake never talked about any of this. He glanced toward me. Now I think I understand. My mother looked confused. My father looked worried. Emma said nothing. Daniel held up the first document. A payment record. He paused. 8 years ago, Jake emptied most of his savings account. A ripple spread through the ballroom. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. Daniel continued. At the time, Emma needed professional help dealing with the fallout from the internship incident. He lowered the paper. Jake paid for it. The room froze. My mother's eyes widened. My father stared at me in disbelief. Daniel picked up another document. These are emails between Jake and the people helping resolve the situation. He looked around the room. While everyone else was focused on protecting their own reputation, Jake spent months helping Emma rebuild hers. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound in the ballroom was Daniel's voice. Then he turned toward Emma. Do you disagree with anything I've said? The question hit the room like a shockwave. Emma looked up slowly. For several seconds, she couldn't answer, because she knew the documents were real. The letter was real. The emails were real. The payments were real. Everything Daniel had described actually happened. Finally, Emma lowered her eyes, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, No. The ballroom remained silent, because that single word confirmed everything. And for the first time all evening, The story everyone believed about Emma's success was beginning to crack. For several seconds, nobody said a word. Emma stared at the table. My parents stared at Emma, and nearly 300 guests waited for someone to explain how the evening had gone so completely off script. Daniel remained standing, calm, composed, certain. Then he looked at Emma again. "Do you want me to continue?" The question hung in the air. Emma closed her eyes briefly, then shook her head. "No." Her voice was barely audible. Daniel nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Then he carefully closed the folder. The documents were no longer necessary. Not after Emma had confirmed everything herself. A murmur spread through the ballroom. People whispered to one another, trying to process what they had just learned. The successful attorney, the family's pride, the woman everyone had spent years admiring, had nearly lost everything. And the person who helped save her wasn't a mentor, wasn't a professor, wasn't a senior attorney. It was her brother. The same brother she had just mocked in front of hundreds of people. My mother looked like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She turned toward Emma. "Is it true?" The room immediately fell quiet again. Emma didn't answer right away. For the first time in her life, she seemed completely uncomfortable being the center of attention. Finally, she nodded. "Yes." My father leaned back in his chair, stunned. "Why didn't we know about any of this?" Emma swallowed, because she already knew there was no good answer. Then she said something nobody expected. "Because I didn't want anyone to know how close I came to losing everything." The honesty caught people off guard, including me. Emma looked down at her hands. I was embarrassed. Nobody interrupted. She continued. "I told myself I would fix it." A pause. "But I couldn't." The ballroom remained silent. Then she slowly raised her eyes and looked directly at me. For years, I had imagined what it might feel like to finally hear the truth acknowledged. The reality felt different, quieter, sadder, more complicated. Emma took a breath. "Jake was the only person who stayed." My mother lowered her eyes. Emma continued. "When everyone else was telling me to move on," her voice cracked slightly. "He refused." The room listened. "When I thought my career was over," another pause. "He spent months helping me." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Emma said the one thing nobody in the room expected. "The truth is..." She stopped for a second, trying to compose herself. "Without Jake, I wouldn't be standing here today." The words hit the ballroom harder than anything Daniel had revealed, because they weren't coming from documents, or letters, or evidence. They were coming from her, the person everyone trusted, the person everyone admired, the person who had spent years allowing a very different story to exist. My mother wiped at her eyes. My father stared at the floor. Several guests looked genuinely emotional. Then Emma stood, slowly, and turned toward me. "I owe you an apology." The room remained completely silent. "I should have thanked you years ago," she laughed weakly. "And I definitely shouldn't have made that joke tonight." A few people smiled awkwardly. Emma shook her head. "No matter what happened between us," she paused, "you deserve better than that." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I nodded. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Not because years of resentment had suddenly disappeared. They hadn't. But because for the first time in a very long time, she was being honest. And somehow, that mattered more than the applause that followed. because as nearly 300 people rose to their feet, it wasn't Emma receiving the standing ovation anymore. It was the brother they had spent years overlooking. The standing ovation lasted far longer than anyone expected, not because of me, because of what people had just realized. For years, everyone in that room had believed the same story. A story about Emma's success, a story about determination, a story about achievement. And while most of it was true, it wasn't complete. Now, for the first time, people were seeing the missing chapter. Eventually, the applause faded. Guests slowly returned to their seats. The reception continued. But the atmosphere had changed completely. The jokes were gone. The easy confidence was gone. Even the conversation sounded different. People weren't talking about Emma's career anymore. They were talking about family, truth, gratitude, the things nobody had expected to discuss at a wedding. I spent the next hour trying to avoid attention. Unfortunately, that became impossible. People I barely knew kept approaching me. Some wanted to shake my hand. Others wanted to hear more about what happened. A few simply thanked me for what I had done for Emma. Every conversation felt strange. Not because I wanted recognition, because I wasn't used to receiving it. Eventually, I stepped outside for some air. The evening had cooled. The parking lot was quiet. For the first time all night, nobody was looking at me. Nobody was expecting anything from me. Just silence. A few minutes later, the door opened behind me. I didn't need to turn around. I already knew who it was. My mother. She walked over slowly and stood beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed. I didn't know. The same 3 words people always use when they're faced with something they should have noticed years ago. I nodded. I know. She stared across the parking lot. Why didn't you tell us? I laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because I had spent years wondering if someone would eventually ask that question. Then I answered honestly. Would it have mattered? My mother didn't respond, and that silence told me everything. Because deep down, she knew what I meant. For years, nobody asked about my life. Nobody asked what I was dealing with. Nobody asked what I had sacrificed. The family had already decided who I was, and once people decide who you are, they stop looking for evidence that says otherwise. A few moments later, the door opened again. This time, it was my father. He walked over and stood beside us, quiet as always. Then he looked at me and said something I never expected to hear. We should have paid more attention. Simple words, but they carried more weight than 100 apologies. Because my father wasn't defending himself. He wasn't making excuses. He was admitting the truth. The 3 of us stood there in silence. Then the door opened one last time. Emma. She looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally, like years of carrying something had finally caught up with her. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Emma looked directly at me. You were right, I frowned. About what? She smiled sadly. About people remembering the version of the story that's easiest to tell. The parking lot fell silent again. Emma folded her arms. I spent years pretending that part of my life didn't happen. She looked down briefly. And after a while, I started pretending it didn't matter. I could see tears forming in her eyes. Not dramatic tears, the kind people fight desperately to hold back. Then she said something that surprised me. The worst part isn't that I never thanked you, she paused. The worst part is that I got used to being thanked for things I couldn't have done without you. Nobody spoke, because there wasn't anything left to say. The truth had already done its work. Emma stepped forward, then hugged me. A real hug, not for the guests, not for appearances, just for us. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like the first honest conversation we'd had in years. Later that night, as I drove home, I kept thinking about everything that had happened. The speeches, the revelations, the standing ovation. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized none of those things mattered most. The most important moment happened outside that ballroom, when the applause was gone, when nobody was watching, when people finally stopped protecting the story they preferred and started accepting the truth instead. Because sometimes the biggest victory isn't being recognized. It's no longer needing recognition to know what you were worth all along. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt at peace. Looking back, the biggest lesson from that wedding had nothing to do with secrets, and nothing to do with public recognition. For years, I thought being overlooked meant people didn't know my value. I was wrong. The truth is, some people know exactly what you've done. They just get comfortable with a version of the story that benefits them. My parents weren't bad people. Emma wasn't a bad person. They simply stopped looking beyond the role they had assigned me years earlier. The dependable brother, the problem solver, the person who would always be there when things went wrong. What changed that night wasn't who I was. My value had never changed. What changed was that the truth became impossible to ignore. And sometimes that's all recognition really is. Not becoming someone new, but finally being seen for who you've always been. So, let me ask you something. If someone spent years taking your support for granted, then finally admitted the truth in front of everyone, would that apology be enough? Comment 1 if you would forgive them. Comment 2 if some mistakes change a relationship forever. I'd love to hear your thoughts.